migration and forced migration and about conflict. And so I think the thing about our chapter is it's the most systematic assessment of the literature on both those topics, and was pretty heavily involved in both those, and it's an interesting process. On the migration stuff, we say that an assessment of literature suggests there's good evidence that extreme events cause displacement of people, cyclones, floods and so on, but most of the evidence on that suggests that people who are displaced tend to return. And so we're pretty confident that with the science showing that we're going to get more extremes, that we will therefore see more extreme induced displacement, but that will bring people back. There's evidence that suggests that long-term change in environmental conditions may be associated with migration, but we're not sure about that. We conclude that there's no basis to have confidence in any estimates of the number of migrants in the world. There are numbers floating around there. They are, in some cases, quite literally back of the envelope. We don't have the science to show climate change is going to cause the movement of this many people to this many places. The inverse issue here is, and this is a key finding of a lot of the research on this, is that in some ways the people who are able to move are the people who have capabilities and choices. They can exercise a choice. Things aren't so good here already. But it's the people who don't have those choices, who can't leave, that ultimately are going to be the greatest humanitarian challenge in the future here. The ones who are left behind because they can't leave, because they don't have the skills to move or the money to move and so on. And so we're going to see where there's a significant concern in increasing humanitarian problems in people who are trapped in conditions of poverty in particular locations, exposed to increasing extreme events and deteriorating environmental conditions. We can't leave. And that's going to be a major future humanitarian problem, and of course for some diagnosis of concern. On the conflict side, we can dismiss a few things. There's nobody saying climate change is going to cause violent conflict between countries. The effect of climate change on violent conflict needs to be set into the larger historical landscape here, which is since the end of the Cold War, the world has become more peaceful, particularly because of a reduction of conflict between countries. We're generally getting better at preventing war. Most violent conflict in the world is between countries in the form of sub-state conflicts and small civil wars. The literature on this is of three kinds. Some literature that looks at the collapse of past civilizations, Angkor Wat, Mayan, and so on. And it shows, though the evidence is quite unclear about the mechanisms between climate and civilization collapse, that certainly there does seem to be an association, but we don't really know how it works. It's not a very reliable body of evidence because we're not the same societies as Melbourne. Though indeed our civilizations haven't had to deal with magnitudes of change since those periods of time. So we're better at dealing with it, but actually the future magnitude of risk is going to increase in the future. There's a body of statistical work that looks very closely at the relationship between climate variability and civil conflict, particularly in Africa. There's a fair bit of debate about that, but you could summarise that as saying there appears to be an association indirectly between climate and violent conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have a theory that really explains how it happens. And in fact, that's not very surprising because conflict is multiform and complicated. But there's a reason for concern. And then there are case-based studies, more qualitative, of people in or doing ethnographies or retrospective analyses of conflict and trying to discern whether there's a climate signal. And again, that literature, there's no smoking gun here, but there is an association. So we conclude that climate change can indirectly increase the risk of violent conflict in certain circumstances, particularly in places where there's low incomes, where economic shocks are more likely across society, where the institutions of the state are not necessarily robust, where there's no social protection measures to protect people during times of crisis, particularly in places where there's war in neighbouring areas, particularly in places where there's a recent history of violent conflict. Put all those factors together, you begin to be able to sort of suggest that there are some places that are potentially more at risk here, that climate change could indirectly increase the probability of violent conflict. So there's no smoking gun, there's no climate change that's going to cause war, there's no direct association, but there are sufficient reasons through this assessment of the literature to suggest that there are causes for concern.